The Jane and Finch area of Toronto does not have a good reputation. It's a corridor of high-rise apartments and subsidized housing, and it's perceived as being rife with prostitution and drugs and violent crime. Joan and Lennox Farrell live in that area. They're high school teachers, and for the past 10 years, they've been strong activists around Jane Finch. Joan and Lennox Farrell join me today in Toronto. This is part of our series on Canadian couples. Good morning to you both, and welcome.
Good morning.
And there was a quote in a newspaper article that said, a lot of people think Canada is just a bunch of igloos, and a lot of people think Jane Finch is just one big crack house. I don't know how you react when what do you think when you hear that, Lennox?
I think that the perception, or at least that interpretation of the perception is correct. That many people, I travel across the country, and I make a point when I introduce myself, that is if I'm in a speaking engagement, to say I am from Jane and Finch. Mm-hmm. And for one thing, most everyone knows or has heard of Jane and Finch. And the reaction is one of a kind of intake of breath. I said, yep, real people live in Jane and Finch. And much of what you've heard about the area is not true, and what is true is in many instances overblown. It has problems like many other areas of the city. I would say that the major difficulty of the area is unemployment. There are large numbers of people. It's the second highest concentration of people of African heritage in Canada, outside of Halifax, Nova Scotia. And the major difficulty of the area is unemployment. And this, of course, leads to other difficulties. Then the question of the police in the community with many of the youth. And it's an area that is easy to dump on, and that happens regularly, unfortunately.
What drew you to there, Joan? What drew you there?
You mean to the Jane Finch area itself? The fact that, the concentration, as my husband said, of people there were quite a mix. You have, people from different nationalities. And we thought, well, this would be a good area in which to grow up our kids. They would not just grow in an area where they see people looking only like themselves, but they would be mixing with people of different nationalities. And I think this is good for them. It's rich. I think it really helps to enrich their lives when they mix with other people, when they meet other people from different nationalities and know more about them. It's education to me. It's educational.
And in fact, one of the, we have a kind of an in-community joke that maybe what we should do, we should advertise ourselves as a tourist area. We're better known than Niagara Falls. We're certainly better known across the country than Yonge and Bloor. And there must be something Tourism Canada could do to come to the Jane and Finch area. Of course,
but most of the people who talk about it haven't been there, have they?
Well, they wouldn't come either. I know of students whom I've taught, they know I'm from there, they say when they drive through the area, their parents tell them put up the windows in the cars.
We had an experience as well with our son, the oldest one. He was his 16th birthday, and we thought, okay, get all your friends together. And we got them together. He invited maybe about a dozen people, and we waited. And finally, at the end of the day, when it was time for the party, long after, just about 2 people turned up. So he called up late the night and the next day and saying, well, why didn't you turn up? We were expecting you. And what do you think? They said, well, we were afraid our parents didn't want us to be in Jane and Finch that late in the night. So it's, the stigma is there.
Give me the reality. I touch it. What's it like as opposed to the stereotypical misperception?
It's a village.
Yeah.
It's like every other village.
It has a village ambience. Both Joan and I grew in villages. I grew in a village called Morvant in Trinidad and Tobago. She grew in a village in the deep south, Mayara. And there's a recognition of people. Regular recognition. You see children grow up, become adults. Some do well, others catch hell. That's kind of sense. And there is, there's a phrase, a sense of community, and it's hard to define simply because sense of community itself is hard to define. It's an ambience and a feeling of belonging. Whenever we leave to go back to Trinidad, we leave to go home. Yet when we leave there to come here, we come just not to Canada, but home is Jane and Finch for us. And our children, all of our children have passed through their teenage years in Jane and Finch. It has been the place where we know best and where we ourselves are known best.
There are drugs.
Certainly.
Oh, yes. Like everywhere else. You would think.
And it's not an excuse. For some of the black youth who are involved in it, we tell them that they are like the black arm of the Ku Klux Klan, because drugs, illegal drugs, serves to demobilize communities. What happens too is that it is not only people who consume it, but many people, they are sellers, and people come into the area to purchase. If you stand by one of the malls or so long enough, you'd see beautiful cars coming up, not of black people, buying and going through. And the problem of drugs in our community is not so much a question of addiction. If it were, why hasn't the government provided rehabilitation centers in the area? It is a problem of economics. Yes. People get into the drug trade because they'd rather do that than push thing at McDonald's for $5 an hour. It's an economic problem. If to look at the problem of drugs, it's a social problem. The question of education is also another difficulty faced by many of our youth. I think one school in our area, high school in our area, it was recently reported in a magazine, Now magazine, that in 4 years, one black student went to university from one of the schools, one of the high schools in the area. So when you have this mix of a large concentration of people of African heritage, the difficulties of education, the question of the police also, who are quite heavy-handed at times, you see the whole mixture that gives this image.
Joan, I think you recently took some children from the area down to Atlanta,
Yes.
and for a lot of them that was their first time out of Jane Finch, and they talked about Jane and Finch as a ghetto. Is that right?
Well, it was not just from Jane and Finch area. They came from Lawrence Heights as well as Regent Park. It was like 3 areas put together, 40 kids altogether, and 8 adults. I happen to be one of them. But it's really a conversation I happen to have overheard. I don't think they were really saying it for everybody here, but I got into the bus before everybody else, and they were maybe about 8 of them sitting at the back of the bus. And I heard them say something, oh, well, look, take us to the ghetto. We like the ghetto kind of thing. And, there's this song becoming, they said, well, miss, we want to see the ghetto, what it's like here. And I didn't know what to say because I was new to the place myself. But I stopped for a moment and I said, well, listen, have you ever thought of what the ghetto really means? They said, yes, that's where we're from. We that's our place, kind of thing. And this was at the very beginning of the trip, by the way. Yeah. And they said, I said, have you ever thought of the ghetto as being a state of mind? It's how you think of yourself. The fact that you live in a ghetto, I mean, to them, it's like, they're so used to being put down that to them, the ghetto is it. And I mean, any student coming out of an environment like that with that sort of thought pattern would definitely feel defeated. And what we're out to eliminate here as teachers in particular is to get rid of the defeat here. Yeah. I mean, yes, there is the social problem, there is the emotional problem, and it's there. But and we could never really, pretend that, failure, we get rid of failures on a whole. It would always, it's a part of living. But what we need to get rid of here is the defeat, the fact that I'm defeated and there is no way out for me. And that, as teachers, in my particular case, and I'm sure my husband, we try to get rid of that. When we teach kids, I begin on the premise that you're capable. I don't even use words like problems or problem or failure in my classroom. I tell my kids, I'm sorry, get rid of it. We're here. What
do you say when you've got
succeed.
A math problem to pose for them?
I'll give you a good example of that. Last day, like 2 days ago, on the board I had some problems all written up, and I said, I wrote like problem 1, problem 2, but long after I wrote it, when we came to it, I told the kids, okay, let's solve this problem number 1. Then I said, oh, by the way, we promised not to use any negative words in this class, so let's change this. Let's use other words apart from problem. And, you know, they started coming out with other, you know, suggestions like, you know, excitement, fun, you know, sort of thing. And I said, well, yes, that's what we want to talk about. So let's do fun number one, challenge number one.
Yeah.
I mean, it was like a big joke, but they got the message, you know. So those
Didn't
who
say
thought they
don't
couldn't
say
do
the
it.
P word.
No, not problem. It's not a problem as such. It's a challenge, and we could overcome challenges. It's there for us to make an attempt. As I said, say to them, if you think of the person who is very good at mathematics, and tell yourself, I could become like that person. What you need to do is practice, and you're going to do it eventually. And so I think it helps at building their confidence first of all, you know, and taking it from there, you know.
I want to talk about you as a couple and your remarkable marriage, but I can't just before. Still about Jane Finch and the real problems there, which you understand. Or, sorry, the real challenges there, the reality there that you understand.
You're a good student. And a
I go to the next
What
class.
somebody says.
No, but when you two say for those kids to get out,
it isn't getting out of the area.
right?
That
That
was
was my question. It's getting out of their state of mind,
the
the lack of
challenge
self-esteem.
which faces us is that more people, professionals, paraprofessionals, who come out of the area must remain in the area. There's also the difficulty that many people who work in the area are terrified by the area. And we say that if you are a teacher